Thank you for joining me again in Enlightenment Online. I'd like to talk to you about enlightenment and psychological health. There's always been an air of romanticism about the spiritual path, and especially about what constitutes psychological health and well-being, and what does not. In fact, we could say that the connection between an awakening consciousness and a being who is psychologically healthy has not been explored deeply enough. So let's begin to do that. Usually we get our notions of psychological health, or what an enlightened psychology is like, through characters in teaching stories. Stories about masters, whether they are the tzaddikim or righteous saints of Jewish teaching stories, or Tibetan stories, or Sufi teaching stories, or Zen koans. We meet characters in these stories who are very unusual and spontaneous, who put their shoes on top of their heads and walk out, who cut cats in half, who mysteriously talk about the cypress tree in the garden, apropos of practically nothing. But we never get to hear about what happens just off stage. After the master goes home to his relatives or family or friends, or goes out to a meal, or has a nightmare, or feels grumpy from overeating. Well, we are all our best in stories, that's for sure. And as powerful and necessary as these types of teaching stories are, as important as they are as tools to help us break through the barriers to freedom, they also serve to give us a distorted picture of what an awakened personal psychology is like, as if that moment in the story is all moments. There is and should be a close relationship between so-called awakening and human sanity, even if that sanity manifests in original and unpredictable ways. Believing that simply having an awakening experience and trying to live from an awakened perspective can lead to serious misunderstandings that will slow down your own spiritual growth and the people you come into contact with as well. These misunderstandings can actually rise to a detrimental level, especially if we think that the point of spiritual work is to transcend personal psychology and transcend the personal self's manifestation as the ego or the I. In other words, if we erroneously think that spiritual work takes place in another arena than the personal, we can run into trouble. When we believe that, when we believe that that's possible, we think that we can get out of our own woundedness, we can set it aside somehow, and find wholeness without the personal self being involved. Or that the personal self's history of imperfect interactions with its culture and its parents and its history in general will magically cure itself when faced with the bright light of understanding. My experience shows me that the contrary is true, that we actually add to our own burden and to the burden of the world by not understanding that the personal self must not be discarded, but healed. All of my own early Satori and enlightenment experiences were with a light that was, it seemed to me at the time, so bright that I thought it was going to eliminate all the shadows in the corners of my psyche, all the areas that my suffering was hanging out in. And I thought that all of my suffering would dissipate like smoke, or like shadows in the bright sun of this new daylight. This, of course, was not true and was not the case. But here's what I understand now. The whole point of spiritual work is to cast a strong light on these areas so that we can see them. Now, let me repeat that. The whole point of spiritual work is to cast a powerful light on these areas so that we can see them. In this way, we can begin to be true human beings doing true human spiritual work, the work of making ourselves one person instead of two people, or many people. The point of spiritual work is to unite everything. The head and the heart, the past and the future, the imperfect and the perfect, the personal self and the transcendent self. Spiritual work is meant to take us out of fantasy and into the real, so that we can see the splits in ourselves and not pretend that they aren't there. Then the awakening self that comes from seeing our total self clearly, even if some of those parts are still broken, is a blessing in and of itself. Even if some of those parts are still broken, to be awake to them is a blessing in and of itself. But this cannot be done without paying attention, and in fact inviting attention, to the personal self and its problems. In other words, and here's a great statement, we only become self-illuminating when we illuminate the self. We only become self-illuminating, which we are already, when we illuminate ourself as it is. Spiritual work lets us walk the territory and not fly over it and think that we've been there. If we continue to believe that the personal self, with its desperate suffering, its uneven growth, and its potential for blindness, is simply going to go away without paying direct attention to it, we're mistaken. As seekers on the path of spirituality, we have to encounter all of our subterfuges and our psychological distortions. And while that's hard in the beginning, this part of the path, this part of the spiritual path, eventually becomes joyful. Instead of feeling depressed over yet another craziness uncovered, and we've all been there, we begin to feel triumphant, like a warrior who has been stalking his enemy and finally gets to confront that enemy. Psychological health is about continual healing and not some mythical, totally healed state. We're here on this earth to heal, and that means healing all the hurt parts of ourselves, continually walking down the corridors of our lives, not towards some eventual not towards some eventual brightness, but right here, right now, in the midst of hard search, within this brightness itself. Isn't that a hoot?